I've been hiking for years. It's something that's always called to me. The idea of escaping into nature and the quiet solitude that only the forest can provide. I've trekked through dense, well-traveled paths where the sounds of nature are drowned out by the footfalls of other hikers. I've wandered along narrow, isolated trails where it feels like the world stops, where every turn is an invitation to something unknown. But nothing could have prepared me for what I experienced on the Vanishing Trail. I first heard about it through a local hiking forum. It wasn't a well-known trail. In fact, very few people even seemed to acknowledge its existence anymore. It was an old, overgrown path that once connected a small mountain town to a distant part of the forest. But now, it had become more of a legend than a trail. There were whispers of strange happenings on the trail. Some hikers got lost and never returned. Others spoke of disorienting sensations, and a few mentioned strange, unexplainable events. It was enough to intrigue me. The descriptions were vague. It was somewhere near that small mountain town, but the locals rarely mentioned it. Some claimed it was untouched by time, forgotten by the local authorities. Others said it had become hidden by the encroaching forest. But one thing was clear: this trail was mostly abandoned, and it was my perfect opportunity for an adventure off the beaten path. So without much hesitation, I packed my gear, checked my equipment, and set out early one cool morning. My phone was fully charged, my boots tightly laced, and the excitement coursing through my veins was palpable. The fog was thick when I arrived at the trailhead. I could barely see beyond a few feet, but the air had a crisp bite to it, and the silence was soothing, almost eerily so. The trail began simply enough. Narrow and winding, it was the kind of trail that seemed to embrace you, drawing you deeper into the heart of the forest. Tall trees formed an arch overhead, their branches weaving together like the arms of giants. The ground was soft, covered with fallen leaves that muffled my footsteps, and the scent of pine and damp earth filled the air. I walked for hours, the only sound the crunch of leaves beneath my boots and the occasional call of a distant bird. But as time passed, something began to feel off. It started when I noticed that the trail markers had disappeared. At first, I didn't think much of it. I had been hiking for a long time, and I assumed I just hadn't noticed the next one. After all, the fog was thick, and the path was growing more and more overgrown. But then, I came to a fork in the trail and found there was no sign, no indication of which way to go. I stood there for a moment, trying to orient myself. The trail should have had another sign here, but it was as if the forest had erased it. No matter, I thought. Just trust your instincts. So, I chose the left path, hoping to find the trail markers again further along. As I walked, I began to notice something strange about the trees. They were growing closer together now, the trunks almost crowding me. Their branches seemed to be bending inward, creating an unnatural canopy overhead, as if they were guiding me down this path. The way they twisted together felt deliberate, like the forest itself was trying to pull me deeper into its embrace. I slowed down, unsure of what to make of it, and took a long swig from my water bottle. That's when I heard it, a rustling sound just beyond my hearing range, but unmistakably there. It wasn't the wind. No, it was too deliberate. Something moving through the underbrush. A large animal, perhaps. At first I thought it might be a deer, but then it came closer, too close. I felt a sudden prickling sensation on the back of my neck, that gut-wrenching feeling that I wasn't alone. I turned around half expecting to see a deer or some other animal, but there was nothing, just the trees and the fog. I told myself it was just the wind, a trick of the mind, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I picked up the pace, hoping to shake off the sensation. The forest seemed to open up in front of me, and for a moment I thought I saw a clearing ahead. Relief washed over me. It would be a perfect spot to stop for a rest and perhaps even take a few photos. But as I approached, I realized the clearing wasn't a real clearing at all. It was just an opening in the trees. I stood there for a long moment, staring at it, trying to understand what I was seeing. It wasn't a clearing. There was no open space. It was just an illusion, a trick of the trees. I stepped forward, trying to get a better look, but the moment I did, the path behind me had shifted. It wasn't the same. The trees, the ground, the foliage. It was different now. The trail was gone, and in its place was a maze of unfamiliar terrain. I spun around, searching for the fork I had passed earlier, but it was nowhere to be found. Panic began to creep in. I wandered through the dense forest, desperate to find my way back, but no matter how far I walked, nothing looked familiar. The landscape had changed in subtle but profound ways. The trees twisted in odd directions, the underbrush thickened, and the ground became uneven, as though the forest itself was alive, constantly shifting, pulling me deeper. I tried calling out, but my voice was swallowed by the heavy fog and the oppressive silence. Hours, or maybe it was days, seemed to pass. My legs ached from exhaustion, my stomach growled with hunger, and my mouth was dry, but still I pressed on. I knew that I couldn't stop. I couldn't let the forest swallow me whole. Just as my hope began to wane, I saw it. A sign. It was barely visible through the fog. An old wooden marker, crooked and weathered with age. My heart skipped a beat as I rushed toward it, almost afraid to believe my eyes. It was a trail marker, though it looked nothing like the ones I had seen earlier. This one was different. The wood was gnarled and twisted, like it had been carved by something other than human hands, and as I approached, I could swear I saw the letters shift before my eyes, changing as if they had a life of their own. I squinted, trying to read the inscription. My blood ran cold as the words slowly became clear. The path of the lost. It wasn't the same trail anymore. The vanishing trail had become something else, something darker. The letters on the sign seemed to writhe, almost as if they were alive. I looked up at the trees around me and saw that they, too, had changed. They were taller now, their branches intertwining into unnatural shapes, like the fingers of something watching me. I didn't know what was happening. I didn't know if I was losing my mind or if the forest had truly changed, but I had to get out. I turned and began walking quickly, almost running, hoping to find my way back to the trailhead. The fog had thickened, and the chill in the air made it feel like I was walking through a dream, a nightmare. And then just like that, I was back. I stood at the trailhead, the fog lifting as the first rays of the sun broke through the trees. My car was there, exactly where I had left it. I could hardly believe my eyes. I looked down at my watch, expecting to find a few hours had passed, maybe even a day. But what I saw made my stomach turn. Hours had passed, far more than I had thought. It felt like I had been in the forest for an eternity. I couldn't explain what had happened to me. My body ached, my mind was a blur, and yet there I was, standing at the edge of the vanishing trail as though I had never left. All I know is this: the vanishing trail doesn't let people leave easily. It doesn't matter how long you've been hiking, how much experience you have. If you decide to hike the vanishing trail, you may find yourself lost in a place that doesn't belong to the world you know. And when you leave, you won't be the same. If you ever decide to find it, just remember this: some trails are meant to vanish, and some paths are meant to swallow you whole. And whatever you do, Don't look back. I never thought I'd get caught up in something like this. A simple hiking trip, meant to be a break from the daily grind, turned into something far worse, something I can't shake off, something that continues to haunt me even now. It all started innocently enough. My friend Matt had been trying to convince me for weeks to join him on a hiking trip. Matt's always been the adventurous one. He's the type of guy who knows all the local trails, who'll drive for hours to find some hidden spot in the woods where no one else goes. So when he invited me to a secluded forest trail a few hours from the city, I was hesitant but intrigued. He swore it was one of the best spots in the area, quiet, unspoiled, with rugged beauty and challenging terrain. It seemed like the perfect opportunity to get away from the everyday routine and spend a day in nature. I agreed and we set the date. We started early that morning, driving out of the city, leaving behind the clamor of life for the promise of peace in the wilderness. The air was thick with mist, the kind of fog that clung to your skin and made the world feel like it was frozen in time. The deeper we drove into the forest, the more isolated everything became. There was no cell signal, no signs of civilization, just trees stretching on in every direction. When we reached the trailhead, I was surprised at how remote the area felt. The silence was overwhelming. I was used to the sound of distant traffic or the hum of everyday life in the background, but here it was nothing but the occasional bird call or the rustling of leaves as we moved through the woods. Matt led the way, walking ahead with a confident pace that was typical of him. I followed closely behind, taking in the surroundings. Tall, looming trees, their trunks knotted and twisted like ancient sentinels. The ground was soft beneath my boots, covered with a thick layer of moss and fallen leaves. We didn't talk much. The quiet of the forest had a strange sort of weight, and neither of us felt the need to break it. After a couple of hours, the trail began to narrow, and Matt paused. "I'm pretty sure there's a shortcut around here," he said, scanning the trees with a thoughtful look on his face. I shrugged. I wasn't familiar with this part of the forest, but I trusted Matt's instincts. He'd been here before, after all. So I followed as he led us off the main trail and onto a narrower, less maintained path. The way became more difficult as we pushed through thick brush, our progress slowed by thorns and tangled vines. But there was something thrilling about it, something that reminded me of the wildness of the world before people had carved their paths through it. That's when I noticed something strange. In the distance, I heard a faint thumping sound, almost like a drum beat. At first, I thought it was just the wind, or maybe an animal moving through the underbrush, but the sound didn't stop. It was rhythmic, steady, purposeful, and it was getting closer. My stomach tightened as I listened, trying to make sense of it. "Do you hear that?" I asked, my voice a little louder than I intended, the unease starting to rise in my chest. Matt didn't answer right away. He kept moving forward, his gaze scanning the trees. "Yeah," he finally said, his voice tight. "I hear it too. Weird." The sound grew louder, almost deafening. It was as if the very forest itself was pounding in time to some unseen rhythm. We continued moving, but the thumping didn't stop. In fact, it only intensified as we approached a small clearing ahead. My pulse quickened, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. We reached the clearing, and suddenly, the sound stopped. Silence fell again, heavy and suffocating. The air felt thick with tension, and I found myself glancing around nervously, unsure of what to expect next. That's when I saw it. Nailed to a tree in the center of the clearing was a crude wooden sign. It was old, weathered, and looked like it had been carved by hand, But what struck me immediately was the symbol etched into the surface. It wasn't anything I recognized, some kind of sigil or pattern perhaps, but it didn't look natural. It was too deliberate, too ominous, the kind of thing that made you feel like you were being warned, even though you didn't understand why. I started to ask Matt about it when I noticed something else that made my blood run cold. The tree beneath the sign was streaked with dark red marks, as if something, or someone, had been dragged across the ground. The bloodstains were fresh, still slick and glistening in the dim light. I took a step closer, my heart racing, my mind trying to make sense of it all. "Matt?" I called out, my voice shaking now, but when I looked around, he was gone. Panic shot through me like a jolt of electricity. "Matt!" I shouted, my voice rising in urgency, but the clearing was empty. The only sound was the wind rustling through the trees. My mind raced as I spun around, searching for any sign of him. Where had he gone? I retraced my steps, calling out his name over and over, but there was no answer. The woods felt different now. The trees were looming larger, the underbrush more tangled. The path I had been following seemed to disappear before my eyes, and the air felt heavier, thicker, as if the forest itself was swallowing me whole. If the forest itself was swallowing me whole. I ran. My feet barely touched the ground as I bolted through the trees, trying to find the trail again. But every time I thought I recognized a landmark, I'd turn and find myself in a different part of the forest, nothing familiar in sight. The panic was rising now, clawing at my throat, choking me. My breaths came in sharp, shallow gasps, my legs shaking with exhaustion. And then I heard it again, the thumping. But this time, it wasn't in the distance. It was close, very close. The rhythmic pounding reverberated through the trees, shaking the very air around me. My heart slammed against my chest as I spun around, my eyes wide in terror. A figure emerged from the shadows, tall, hunched, moving with an unnatural speed. It was carrying something in its hand, though I couldn't make out what it was. My body froze, the fight or flight response kicking in, and my brain screamed for me to run. I didn't hesitate. I turned and sprinted through the woods, my legs aching, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I just ran. The pounding behind me grew louder, faster, and I could feel the figure closing in. But somehow, I managed to keep running, pushing through the pain, the fear, until I finally broke free of the trees. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. I found myself on a road, an old paved road that I didn't recognize, but it was a sign of civilization, and that's all that mattered. I collapsed, gasping for breath, my chest heaving as I looked back into the forest. It was still, silent, as if nothing had happened. The woods were calm, serene even, like they had never been disturbed. I waited there for what felt like an eternity before I finally gathered the strength to stand. I had to get away. I had to leave. And when I looked at the forest one last time, I knew I would never go back. I never saw Matt again. He disappeared without a trace, just as mysteriously as he had been taken by the woods. I tried searching for him, tried asking around, but no one seemed to know where he had gone. But I know one thing for sure. The thumping wasn't from an animal. It wasn't the wind either. It was something deliberate, something that had been waiting for me. And whatever it was, I don't think it's done with me yet. I had always been a fan of hiking alone. It was my escape from the chaos of life, an opportunity to disconnect, challenge myself, and immerse in the peace that only nature could offer. The silence of the forest, the sound of my boots crunching along the trail, the rhythm of my breath as I pushed myself up steep inclines. These were the things that calmed me. But this hike, the one that took me deep into the pinewood forest, changed everything. It made me question everything I thought I knew about the wilderness and about myself. I'd been planning this hike for weeks. Pinewood Forest was a place I had read about but never dared to venture into, mainly because it was known for its remoteness and difficulty. The Pinewood Loop Trail was over 20 miles long, snaking deep into the heart of the forest, a place few hikers had the stamina or the courage to explore. The route was challenging, with steep inclines, narrow paths, and thick underbrush that could easily swallow a trail. But that was exactly why I wanted to do it. I wanted to prove to myself that I could handle it. The first few miles were uneventful. It was just me, the sound of my boots crunching over gravel, the occasional bird call, and the rustling of leaves in the wind. The forest, though dense, felt familiar. The trees were tall and majestic, their trunks twisted and gnarled like old guardians of the woods. The sunlight filtered through the canopy in thin beams, creating patches of warmth on the cold, damp earth. It was peaceful, serene. But the deeper I went, the more the forest seemed to change. The trees grew taller, their trunks thicker, their branches intertwining above to form a near impenetrable canopy that blocked out most of the light. The air grew cooler, and the path became less defined, disappearing into tangles of roots and underbrush. I had to keep my eyes on the ground to avoid tripping over roots or getting snagged by the thorns. The sounds of the forest grew quieter, the birds less frequent, and an eerie silence settled over the place. I didn't think much of it. It was just the isolation that made the forest feel so heavy, so distant from the rest of the world. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I had been hiking for several hours when I reached an old weathered bench nestled at the edge of a small clearing. It looked like it hadn't been used in years. The wood was cracked and faded, the metal supports rusted. I stopped to rest, to catch my breath, and to drink some water. As I sat on the bench, wiping the sweat from my forehead, I looked out over the clearing. The wind had picked up, and the trees seemed to sway in a way that made the forest feel alive, breathing, watching. That's when I first noticed it. The eyes. At first I thought it was my mind playing tricks on me. I had been hiking for hours after all. My body was tired, and my mind was probably a little worn out too. But when I looked around, I could feel them. Eyes, watching me, from the underbrush, from the trees, from the shadows. It was subtle at first, just the sensation that I wasn't alone, but it grew stronger with each passing moment. There was no movement, no sound, just the overwhelming feeling that something or someone was observing me from just out of sight. I looked around, trying to catch a glimpse of what it might be, but there was nothing. No rustling leaves, no animal moving through the brush, just stillness. But I could feel it. I shook my head, telling myself it was just my nerves getting the best of me. The isolation had made me paranoid. I stood up, adjusted my pack, and decided to keep going. But as I continued down the trail, the feeling didn't go away. In fact, it only intensified. The sensation of eyes on me, watching me, following me. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself that it was just the wilderness playing tricks on my mind. But as I walked, I started hearing faint rustlings from behind me. Not the usual noises of the forest, the scurrying of small animals or the creaking of trees in the wind, but something else, something deliberate. It was as if something was following me. It was close enough that I could hear the crunch of leaves, but when I turned to look, There was nothing there, just the trees, just the shadows, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I quickened my pace, trying to put more distance between myself and whatever or whoever was behind me, but it didn't help. The rustling continued, just out of sight, always a few steps behind me, never enough to catch up, but always present. I looked down at the ground, trying to focus on the trail ahead of me, but then I saw something that made my heart race. A footprint. At first I thought it was mine, but it didn't match. The size was different. The depth of the impression was deeper, and the way it was spaced out didn't make sense. Whoever or whatever was following me was walking in my footsteps, but their stride was longer, their steps more deliberate. My stomach dropped as I realized the implications. Someone else was out here with me. Someone who had been following me for miles. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart pounding in my chest. I strained my ears, listening for any sound, any movement that might explain what was happening, but the forest was still, too still. I thought I saw something move in the trees, a shadow darting between the trunks, but when I blinked, it was gone. I couldn't be sure if I had imagined it or if it had been real, but my gut told me it wasn't. Something was out there, something that had been following me. I tried to calm myself, reminding myself that I was just being paranoid. Maybe it was an animal. Maybe it was just the eerie stillness of the forest playing tricks on my mind. But when I turned back to the trail, I saw something else. More footprints. They were bigger now, clearer. The edges were crisp and sharp, like they had been made by boots, not bare feet. The trail was getting steeper, and I had to focus more on my footing, but my mind kept drifting back to the footprints. They were getting closer, the steps more pronounced, and the feeling that I was being watched grew more intense. I couldn't take it anymore. I turned around and sprinted down the trail. My lungs burned, my legs screamed in protest, but I didn't stop. I ran faster, pushing myself harder, but the footsteps behind me kept pace. They were always there, never faltering, matching my stride, never slowing. It was as if something or someone was following me, mimicking my every move. I didn't know how long I ran, but it felt like hours. The forest blurred around me, and the only thing that mattered was getting away from the feeling that was closing in on me. I didn't care about the pain in my legs or the sweat pouring down my face. I just wanted to escape. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I saw a break in the trees, a small road, a sign of civilization. I ran toward it, the sound of my footsteps pounding in my ears, but when I reached the road, the forest was quiet again. The footsteps had stopped. I stopped too, gasping for air, my legs trembling beneath me. I turned around, looking back into the depths of the pinewood forest. The trees stood silent, their dark branches swaying gently in the wind. But the feeling didn't go away. I still felt those eyes on me, watching from the shadows, waiting. I never went back to that trail. I never hiked alone again. And to this day, I can't shake the feeling that something is still out there, something that knows me, something that waits for the right moment to follow me again. I don't know what I felt out there in the pinewood forest, but I know this. I was never truly alone, and I'm not sure I ever will be again. If you enjoyed those terrifying legends and stories, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for more haunted stories. Until next week, sweet dreams.